Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Olka Joshi-Hansen. I'm Chief Program Officer here at Grantmakers for Education. And on behalf of our Executive Director, Celine Coggins, as well as members of our team who are on this call with us, I want to thank you for joining us today, taking time out of what we know are busy days for today's session, Shifting Power in Grant Making. We are using today's meeting both as a great learning opportunity from our 4 panelists and also as the kickoff event for a new impact group. Impact groups are groups in the education for Grantmakers for Education community who come together over an extended period of time to really dig into issues that are of interest in a sustained way. And so this issue of equity in grant making is obviously something that everyone is grappling with. And so we're going to use today's call and webinar to both learn and then take some interactive time in breakout groups where we can dig in a little bit and do some brainstorming around questions that folks have when it comes to equity in grant making and shifting power, topics that folks might want to explore further, resources that folks have. And then based on today's session and the feedback you all give us, we will be planning future events all around this topic. So I would like to introduce our panelists for today. We are joined by Savannah Chan, who is Vice President of Systems Reinvention at Teach for America. We have Greg Gunn, who's the board chair of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, Meredith Olson, who's president of the Vela Education Fund, and Shruti Sarah, who's managing partner of the education portfolio at NewProfit. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for your time today. So we are going to start off by letting each of you spend about 5 minutes just sharing a little bit about your organization, about the work that you've been doing around shifting power in your grant making practices, and perhaps a couple of high-level lessons learned. So I'm going to kick it off to you, please, Savannah. Let's start with you first.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Savannah Chan, coming at y'all live from Oakland, California. It is wonderful to be here with the GFE crew. It's been a minute for me. As Olka said, my title is Vice President of Reinvention at Teach for America. What that means is that I help lead basically an entrepreneurial kind of R&D lab within Teach for America that's about 2 years old now. And our motto is inspired by Gracie Boggs. It's transforming ourselves to radically transform learning. So we do 2 things within that motto, right? One, we really work to use our power, privilege, positionality at Teach for America to further people who have been out in front doing this work of learning reinvention for mad long, certainly longer perhaps than Teach for America has been doing it. And then also we use our lab to really think about how do we make changes, transform ourselves, transform Teach for America? What are the ways in which we can also do that? And so we think a lot about innovative pedagogy and how the lessons from reinvented pedagogy and the future of learning can be translated into the future of the organization. And so one of the things that we have done and tested and tried over the last 2 years is something called Enduring Ideas. To provide direct, no strings attached funding to folks who are doing the future of learning across communities across the country. But it is also a co-creation accelerator for folks in the field and also Teach for America staff to learn how to co-create alongside external partners, alongside young people. So we've distributed about $1 million, more than that over the course of 2 years. We've had over 100 participatory decision makers, 85% of whom are people of color and 50% of whom are under the age of 20. And we've had about 5 decision-making rounds over the past 2 years where we're really starting small, building, iterating, and trying to figure out you never arrive, but practicing participatory decision-making and what that means. And how adults, how leaders in the field can really learn by doing what it means to do and to co-create educational decisions, whether it be philanthropy, budgets, strategy, all kinds of things. So that's where I'm coming into this conversation. Appreciate y'all for being here. And I can pass it over to Shruti.
Thanks, Savannah. Hi, all. Shruti Sarah, as Olka introduced me, from NewProfit, and I lead our education work. And for those of you not familiar with NewProfit, we're a national venture philanthropy organization, and we back breakthrough social entrepreneurs who are really working to advance equity and opportunity for all in this country. So I came to this work or this conversation with some thinking that we've been doing for a long time now, but really have doubled down on over the past 2 years. So NewProfit for many years has been involving constituents in a number of our grant making cycles to just get smarter about the decisions that we're making. But in 2022, we decided to systematically run 2 pilots in parallel with one another that were designed to build this approach into the DNA of our work at NewProfit and all of our grant making going forward. And the intent behind this was, we talk so much about, and we work to advance proximity in the work that we do. And we really look at proximity as true expertise. It's not a token thing that we're looking at. We're not looking for, just sharing of identity. We are recognizing that people who are proximate to the communities that they serve are smarter about how to serve those communities more effectively. So when we think about proximity, we have to think about it for ourselves too. How do we get closer to the communities that we're aiming to serve? And one way to do it was to involve constituents in our grant making process. And we talk about it as proximate grant making. So in 2022, we started, as I mentioned, 2 experiments, pilots rather, side by side. We launched a parent advisory council, which was made up of parents and parent leaders, education advocates that we sourced from a parent power organization, DC PAVE. For those of you who live in DC, you'll know who this is, and some of you outside of the area. Parents Amplifying Voices in Education is the name of the group. And we sourced 6 parents, parent leaders from that group. These are people who are really knowledgeable about the education system. And they've been working to advocate for parents throughout their community, in addition to their own needs for their own children. And we worked with them to bring their voice and bring their questions into our process of making a set of investments around well-being and education. The other group that we created was a worker advisory board. And this was to work alongside our X-Prize Grand Challenge, our Future of Work X-Prize Grand Challenge, where we went through a process, as you all know, with these kind of grand challenges. There's a process of moving organizations from initial thinking to kind of piloting a program. And the Worker Advisory Board, in this case, it was 150 frontline workers that we sourced from large nationwide employers like Goodwill Industries, who provided advice and guidance to the Grand Challenge applicants at every step of the way. So they were a sounding board, they were trusted advisors, and they were really just supporting the social entrepreneurs to test and think through all of their work from ideation to launch. And over the last few years, we've honed and refined these groups, and we really have built this work into the DNA of NewProfit. The groups have converged in some ways. The Parent Advisory Council has gotten larger. The Worker Advisory Board has gotten somewhat smaller over time. And we've learned from one another about how to do this better. And we're looking at other constituency groups to expand into. So just a few things as to what this means to us. So it's impacted our initial decision-making, which we would have expected, to be honest. That was the explicit intent of this, to bring the expertise of our parents, our workers to bear to affect our decision-making. And what we found, though, was that there were still surprises that we hit. So even with our best intent, there were moments that our team didn't realize that something we thought was espousing equity actually missed meeting our constituents where they're at. So they kind of pushed us on our thinking in certain ways. It's also impacted our portfolio organization's focus. So from the very moment of investment selection on, our portfolio organizations have been asked questions by our Parent Advisory Council members and our Worker Advisory Board. And it really pushed them, multiple of our social entrepreneurs, to realize where they may have work to either change their messaging or change their actual work to involve constituents more fully in their work, in their design, and in authentic feedback loops. And finally, it's impacted our philanthropic focus areas. So for instance, last year, in the beginning of last year, we did a series of focus groups to think about what the future of learning and school design should be in a post-COVID world. And this work has really deeply impacted our focus areas and how we think about our priority areas for philanthropic investment. Our PAC members were a big part of that. Our Parent Advisory Council members were a big part of that. Sorry, we use the term PAC, not only is it an acronym for this, but it's a little tongue in cheek because of the influence we want them to have on us. So that's the point there. So I will just close with, we have a lot of lessons that we can share on this, what worked, what didn't, what we have done differently over time. But the kind of meta comment that I'll make is that when we approach proximate grant making, we found that learning something that challenges our thinking, changes our design, goes at the fundamentals of the way that we approach something is really a sign of success as opposed to a sign of failure. We're not putting our hypotheses out there to be right. We're putting our hypotheses out there, and we want our constituents to help push us and to really test our thinking. And so turning that on its end was something that was important to us as we went forward. Okay, with that, I might pass it along to Greg.
Great, thanks, Shruti. Yeah, so my name is Greg Gunn, and I'm in my third and final year as board chair of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation in Quincy, Massachusetts. And I'm delighted to see our CEO, Ghislaine Ngonu, here. And she's been really one of the key architects, if not the key architect of our transformation. So hopefully she'll keep me honest in case I get anything wrong. One of the, we're an endowed foundation that's been doing grant making in education for over 30 years. But starting around 2016, 2017, for a number of years, we had been focused on things around student-centered learning, right? Changing instructional practices, a lot of things to try to be more conducive to the academic and growth needs, particularly of underserved students. And so we had spent nearly a decade doing that kind of work. And in the course of the regular strategy review, we saw a couple of things that were concerning to us. One was that as we were starting to talk more to our communities and talking more to youth groups, which we were starting to fund at the time, and family groups, which we were starting to fund more of, we were finding that a lot of the policies that we were pursuing weren't really on the top 10 lists of the kids and families. When you asked what they were fighting for at the moment, our list wasn't overlapping as well with theirs as we would have liked. And then another thing that we were starting to recognize was that we talked about the needs of underserved students, but we didn't spend a lot of time talking about race within that and the dynamics of race as a distinct factor within that, both in terms of the communities we were trying to serve, but in terms of the experiences those communities were having with education. So those sort of two issues really prompted what became a pretty deep reflection and study process that both the board and staff undertook in parallel. We did some work separately, some work together to really dig deep on race, understand racial inequity, racial equity, privilege, lots of different things. And at the end of that process, we got to a place where we sort of affirmed a different set of a new set of racial equity principles. And then that led into a strategy overhaul where we said, okay, if we think about racial equity principles and sort of best practices in philanthropy, what should our strategy look like now? And through that, we decided to really follow the approach that like Shruti and lots of other people I'm sure in this community have discussed, which is trying to prioritize things that the community is asking for. Listening to the community, engaging actively with communities, putting those priorities at the center, and then incorporating more trust-based grant-making practices, right? Really everything from general operating support to multi-year funding, streamlined application processes, a stronger relationship and trust. And so we agreed to go in that direction, and the staff really overhauled a lot of our grant making processes in a remarkably short period of time. And this was this was over 2018, 2019. So one of the things that I was incredibly proud of was that when things started going crazy in 2020, after George Floyd's death, our organization was kind of ready in many ways for that moment. We weren't just starting to talk about race; it was already front and center. So the question became for us like, okay, we're a racial equity organization. What do we do here, and how do we move? And I was really proud that the staff, and the staff and board members sort of led us to increase our grant making in that year very significantly, and to some areas that were adjacent to education, not just in education. So now we're a couple of years further into this process, and so I'll leave the process piece there. I'll just leave a couple of learnings that I think we're still working through. One, I think one of the most positive things is that I frequently hear comments from staff that they feel like they're doing some of the most important, impactful, relevant, and grounded work that they've ever done in philanthropy, because they know it's connected to what the community wants. They know it's informed by community priorities, and yet still has the strategic vision that they've always brought to their philanthropic work. Second learning is that leaning into the complexities of racial equity work, I think, has been very challenging, and it's broken all of our standard metrics for how you think about progress, success, expectations, and timelines. And I think, frankly, this has been exceptionally difficult for our board to get its head around. So that's got its own issues. And then the third thing that I'll just leave is that, these questions of shifting power in grant making, once you're talking about shifting power, those questions aren't just going to stay in the grant making lane. Those questions are going to creep across the organization to all different kinds of governance and operational issues. And not everybody is comfortable with that when it happens. So that's one thing that I think we're actively grappling through as an organization. So I'll leave it there. All right, and who's left for me to kick it to on the panel? Meredith.
So my name is Meredith Olson, and I lead the VELA Education Fund. I am so excited to hear many common themes across this panel. So I think this is going to be a great discussion. Let me tell you a little bit about VELA. So VELA is an organization that was in the planning stages in 2017 and 2018, and then formally was established in 2019. So we've been up and running for about 3 years. The organization is committed deeply to a belief in people and in building relationships of trust and respect among people. So what grounds us in our work is that we believe that the purpose of education is to enable every student, every child, to acquire the necessary knowledge, skills, and have the experiences that will enable them to live a life of meaning and purpose, the life that they want to live on their terms. And so when we think about education systems in America today, too often we see them falling down on that goal or those goals. And so we feel like the system is ripe for transformation. And that transformation can happen in a lot of different ways. It can happen both within existing systems, but it can also happen outside of traditional education systems in new and unconventional ways. And so that's the lane where VELA has decided to make its value proposition and its investment decisions. So at VELA, we talk about investing in permissionless innovation. And that's really important to us. And let me describe what we mean by permissionless innovation. It's an increasingly popular term. Well, what we mean by it is that, we want to have an environment where social entrepreneurs are able to offer solutions and services without requiring the blessing of anyone. Meaning they don't need the blessing from policymakers, from funders, or for people in power. They're held accountable only to the families and the children that they serve, right? And so we want to invest in the social entrepreneurs that are getting after that. These are folks who are fiercely independent, they're autonomous, they're self-directed, but they operate from a position of humility and a desire to learn and improve and collaborate with others. So let me tell you a little bit about what we've done so far. So since 2019, VELA has awarded more than 1,300 grants and micro grants to social entrepreneurs who are these independent, permissionless innovators. And where are they? Who are they? Well, they are teachers, they are community leaders, they are families, they are people who are boldly reimagining education outside of traditional environments. They are in all 50 states. We have grantees in 3 US territories. They are rural, they are urban, they are suburban. There's broad socioeconomic representation. There is broad representation by race and ethnicity. The one thing they have in common is that, look, they can't not do this work because it's too important. And they're completely committed to serving kids and their families. So we offer trust-based philanthropy. So we give grants with very little due diligence, very limited on the front end. And then we make decisions quickly, less than a month, and distribute cash rapidly. And then we we invite social entrepreneurs into our community. It's non-coercive, it's purely voluntary. And we offer the opportunity to engage in deep research that's participatory. And because it's voluntary, because it's not coercive, we get a lot of response. It turns out folks want to learn, they want to learn together, they want to help design the research questions, and they want to meet and collaborate with other people who might be experiencing similar challenges and might have solutions that could help them. So what have we learned so far? Well, number one, we thought it was going to be a challenge to build pipeline. We were totally wrong. I got to tell you, there's virtually insatiable demand in communities everywhere in America. You just scratch beneath the surface and you find innovators who are doing amazing things. And then secondly, when you invest in trust-based philanthropy and philanthropy that's grounded in a deep belief in people, that every person is capable and they've got good ideas, right? 2 things happen. Number one, you build confidence. And so folks say, we hear this all the time, they say, oh my goodness, you believe in me and you're not going to tell me what to do? And you're just there's got to be a catch. You're going to let me use this funding however I want? And we say, yeah. Most of the time, they've never received funding from anyone before. This inspires them, it gives them confidence in their work, and my goodness, it just bolsters their efforts. So that's the first thing. The second thing we see is that it unleashes creativity. So when you unconstrain because you trust, and you don't have a laundry list of A, B, C, D, E, F, G requirements, now you're letting social entrepreneurs who are closest to the families and the kids make the decisions. This unconstrains their creativity. It lets them blossom and offer what they want to offer. And then as they have challenges, it gives them the opportunity to adapt and iterate and not have to go back and ask for permission to do so. And so, and then the third thing, and I shouldn't have said there were 2 things. There's the third thing, when you offer trust-based philanthropy and you do it in small increments, you're essentially democratizing access. So it's all comers. And for us, what we've seen is that the diversity of applicants just exploded once we made grant making very accessible. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Olga.
No, thank you all so much. So there are like 5 directions we could head, but I'm going to be inspired by the chat. And Greg, you started to speak to this, and I'm wondering if you can speak to all, and this is open to all of you, how did you have to think differently about defining impact, measuring impact, and a specific question, right? What role does measurement play in the context of shifting power from EOLA? So I'm going to throw that out because it definitely seems to be a big thing that holds us in place sometimes. Okay, Greg, why don't you start, since you mentioned it very specifically, and we'll give the rest of you time to think.
Sure. I think, there are a couple of manifestations here. So we had come from the education space, and particularly the K-12 education space, right? And there, we sort of have this operating belief, which one may say was actually a fantasy, that you could map, here's what we're going to put in, and here's what we expect to get out. right? That we're going to put this money in and we're going to expect certain kinds of student outcomes, or we're at least going to expect a certain set of program activity or programmatic outcomes, right? You know, like that barely works at best, right? Now when you open the aperture beyond a school or an individual institution, and you're trying to talk about your contribution to a movement, right? Or you're trying to talk about your contribution to even a legislative campaign, you know, which, you know, isn't something we do, but different kinds of advocacy campaigns you may support. You know, you're a contributor, right? You don't control the process, you don't control the outcome, and so if you can't turn loose some of this, you know, input output expectation, you're going to make yourself crazy. And, you know, then add on top of that just the, you know, whether you expecting what kind of wins to expect and when and where, you just can't map those out easily. You can spend a lot of time trying to catalog those, but again, the reality of it is you probably get to the end of a year or 3 years and look back and say, what did we get done over this time? And is there some of that stuff we want to keep going with? But there's such a traditional philanthropy way of still wanting to have measurable, predictable timeframes, and it just doesn't work in this space. But if somebody has figured it out, please show it to me, because I'd have a lot fewer people breathing down my neck if there was.
Thanks for saying that, Greg. I'm glad you started, because I'll build off of that. The reason I wasn't jumping to answer this question is because we've never approached our work in this kind of way. So NewProfit was founded about 23, 24 years ago. And from the very beginning, we've always given fully unrestricted grants, like Meredith's language about trust-based philanthropy. But yeah, this has been since our very founding. We haven't ever approached our money in a way where we're asking people to jump through loads of hoops for it. We do have a diligence process, but it's largely because our engagement with organizations is so intense that we want to make sure we're both opting into the relationship. And that's what diligence for us is about. It's about a two-way relationship building opportunity that we take some time to develop, so that we can really approach this so that an organization is not coming to us for the money. Yeah, like, look, everybody wants the money. But an organization isn't coming to us for the money. The organization is coming to us for the full suite of support that we can provide, and the money is part of that. So our money is definitely worth its weight in gold in that sense, because unrestricted funding is so rare in the space. But that being said, again, we actually, I think for many years, we were bucking the entire trend in philanthropy, and we were telling organizations, we actually don't want you doing an RCT too early, because it's a massive investment for an organization to make. And if you do it too early, you're locking in before you've actually figured out your innovation. And I would still say the same thing. So we've been spending a lot of time thinking about innovative approaches to evaluation that don't require the kind of traditional methods of getting there. Obviously, with technology, you can do a lot more of this, as we've seen with a number of organizations that we work with. But again, that's not our approach, and none of this it hasn't fundamentally been impacted by involving constituents in our work, by sharing power with constituents. So I'll just name that we've always shared power with our social entrepreneurs, and that's the way that we think about it.
Before Meredith and Savannah jump in, Shruti, could you give a specific example of a different kind of, metric or outcome that you've had? You said with technology, you can do it more easily. So I'm just curious if you could give an example of that.
Oh yeah, I mean, so Zern, an organization that both Greg and I sit on the board of, but one of our portfolio organizations, is able to do super rapid A/B testing of approaches, and see what's the impact of that A/B testing. They also have so much, they have access to so much data that researchers are able to take their data and pull out insights constantly about what's working and what isn't, which has been critical during the pandemic. where, you know, we've got these narratives about what's working and what isn't. So for instance, with Omicron in the beginning of this calendar year, you know, the debate that was going on politically was whether to open schools or whether not to open schools. What Zern's data showed was that it wasn't actually about whether the schools were open. So the K-shaped learning curve came back based on income. So higher income communities were doing better than lower income communities. But the size of that difference wasn't based on whether or not your school was open. It was based on the COVID transmission rates in your area, which frankly makes a lot of sense. There's a lot that you can pull from that. So you can say your school was closed, but my teachers were still teaching. I was still able to go on. I, as a student, was still able to go online. My family was able to focus on this because we didn't have a very high COVID transmission rates in my county or my city. So it kind of debunks the narrative, but you can get that with data that is gathered real time and easily analyzable, which is probably not a word, but where you can do easy analysis on that. And Greg, feel free to correct me on any of that, but that's one example I'd pull out.
Great, thanks. And sorry, Sunana and Meredith, I want to give this back to you on the issue of impact and measurement.
Just listening to Greg and saying, speak it, just speak it louder and and speak it to other board members on other foundation boards. I also, by the way, and I don't know, Iola, if I'm saying your name correctly, but I saw you coming off mute. So if you wanted to give more nuance or like thoughts on the question, love to hear that, and apologies if I said your name incorrectly.
No, I'm good. Thank you. I'm just listening in. Thanks.
Okay, cool. So, you know, it's really interesting. There is, all of this is right? Like pushing on different forms of metrics, really having to, I think you say like break the model, Greg, something like that. Like you have to break something. What we talk about often is like breaking your mental model of what works and what kind of data you collect. I think what I often say to people is like, storytelling is a form of data that we undervalue all of the time. And I'm not even just talking about quantitative data, I'm talking about stories and what that means for people. I think also learning in community, as Meredith was talking about, is a form of data. So, you know, in a similar way to what Meredith is doing at VELA, you know, we do not ever ask for any type of report after awards are made, but we do request that we stay in community and just be in relationship and in community with one another. And that leads to us, you know, having a deeper understanding of what impact is and being able to tell those stories in a different way, but also it allows for folks to be able to tell their own narrative of what that impact is. Now, and I will say what's interesting about that is having now worked with over 100 decision makers from across communities, both adults and young people, you know, philanthropists are not like, I feel like we often say like philanthropy has these old metrics and need to switch, but it's been interesting for me to see how deeply embedded these ideas of impact and outcome are in like 16-year-olds who have, by the way, been in schools that are asking them to like think about learning in a very specific quantitative way and who are asking them to take SAT scores. So like what I'm very interested in is like the future of learning, the future of philanthropy, design. They're all kind of like connected to each other in a way. And these ways in which we think about, you know, scale and impact and number of students served and all of these things are appearing in folks who have, this is the first time they've ever decided on a grant award, right? And so one of the like guidelines or things we talk about with decision makers when we onboard and like think about working with folks is like, we say break your mental model of what works. You know, like how can you break your mental model of thinking about scale and impact in traditional ways? How are applicants defining impact in their own terms? And how do we think about scale differently? Scale can be deep and not wide. What does that mean? What does that look like? Just because someone can't scale it to many different communities, does that mean it's necessarily bad? So, so I will just say like, there is that. And also there's lots of people that want to know like, okay, y'all didn't drawing ideas. Like what percentage of, you know, applicants had XYZ impact? Like that formula that Greg is talking about is a formula that a lot of people still hold who are going to be stakeholders in these types of these types of programs. And so what I'm always trying to balance is like, well, what does that mean if we can't do the mindset shift for everybody that is a stakeholder in a given scenario, like, what do you do? And the question is like, I don't have the answer for that, right? But it's like that translation is what I've been really like thinking about and playing with over the last couple of years. And so I think, you know, I think that's an important tension to like sit in and be like, we don't really know yet, but communities like this, if we're like together and having conversations, can really chop it up and figure it out, or at least get closer, practice figuring it out.
Thanks, Savannah.
So this whole question is, I mean, this is a question that comes up every day. It's existential to the work that we all do. At Vela, we feel, and it is probably similar for other folks on this panel, we're sitting in the middle. So on the one hand, we have grantees who are the recipients of grant funding. And then on the other hand, we have funders who are contributing to our efforts in order to support these grantees. So we're in the middle. And so when you engage in trust-based philanthropy and you simplify the due diligence and reporting process, that is both simultaneously liberating for your grantees, and it's basically it's energy and oxygen for them to go be creative and to build their confidence because you're not telling them what to do. And then it's terrifying for your funders, because it means that they're having to assume a much greater risk tolerance than they typically are comfortable absorbing. And so how do you get around that? This is a challenge. So here's the thing though, if traditional grant making processes would rely on a simple set of impact metrics that are looking at outputs and outcomes and however you want to define it, right? I think there's a certain degree of false precision and comfort in some of those metrics, right? There's also the downside risk that if you agree on, say, a common benchmark or 2 or 3, right, you're essentially preordaining the outcomes. You're predetermining the outcomes. So at that point, then your downstream, granted, you know, your partner organizations are really just outsourced extensions of your operation. So you essentially have all the smart people at the initial funder level who are designing exactly what they want. They're the Wizard of Oz. They're the ones who are the marionettes. And then all of, you know, their grant partner or sub-grant partner, and then the follow-on community-based partners are really just instruments in delivering against that overall master plan. Well, we're challenging and saying we want to do something different. In fact, maybe, just maybe, those folks at the initial funding source don't have all the answers. Maybe they don't have all the expertise despite their background and credentials. Maybe it doesn't make sense to take their values and priorities that they care so deeply about and insert their values and priorities for the values and priorities of the people on the ground who are closest to the work. And so what that puts us in the position of doing as being the intermediary is to, look, we are planting our flag and we are going to put a stake in the ground supporting our community-based entrepreneurs, these organizations who are generating massive demand and serving their constituents. And then we've got to advocate for them as we talk to our sources of funding. But it takes a lot of courage to do that, because ultimately they can just say no. Like, we're not going to give in this way. But yet, you know what? When you have the example of a better way and you show that it's producing these like huge multiplier effects and better results, then it's hard to argue with it. But you got to have those examples in order to show them.
Thank you all so much. So I am going to make a game time call, and I'm saying this partly for our panelists because we had a plan, but I'm seeing a lot of cameras off. We were going to go into small breakout groups, but I'm thinking it may be better for us to stay together. However, I have dropped a link in the chat to a Jamboard. And on the Jamboard, there are 3 different prompts, like questions you're left with, topics you'd like to discuss and explore in the future, or structures you'd like to explore for those of you who might be interested in joining the impact group that's going to come out of this first conversation, and interesting resources that this group might want to explore together. So if folks want to jump into the Jamboard while we keep going with this conversation, feel free to put things in, feel free to put more questions in the chat, and we'll just continue to kind of to garner wisdom from the 4 of you, because I think the work you've done and the insights you're sharing are really big. So I want to play off or sort of go further with that issue of discomfort, sort of what's really difficult, and what Ghislaine and Emily were sort of agreeing with in the chat, right? This is uncomfortable work. It's unlearning. It's taking the things we thought we knew and we thought we were good at and really kind of putting those aside. And so I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the kinds of discomfort you encountered, the ways that you kind of move through it. And that can be at an individual level, it could be at a team level, it could be at a board level. And Greg, in particular, if you're willing, I know there are a lot of folks on this call who are with endowed foundations as opposed to intermediary organizations. And so to the extent you're willing to share how you were able to bring your board along, that would be great.
I'm happy to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Greg, you can start.
No, you go, please.
And then I'll pass it to you, Greg. But there's a story that immediately comes to mind, and some of you I might have said this to. But I remember the very first time we did kind of our bigger scale Enduring Ideas process. This was in, I don't know, like August 2020. And some of you know me from my Remake Learning days back in the day. And there were a lot of people who applied to Enduring Ideas who were from Remake Learning or who I just knew in the field were doing incredible future of learning work, right? And when I say that our decision making is participatory or proximate, should you give you a new word that I really love? It's not an advisory group or a recommender, like they make the decision. And so if that is the case, what I found at the end of that first process was like, they made really different decisions than I would have made and saw very different futures than I saw. And I knew even in that moment, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to send declination letters to people that I think like are doing incredible work, who I deeply care about, who I have relationships with. Like this, it literally pained me. And I think about every time I go through this process, like I think that happens every time. It happened that first time and it happens every time. And every time I go back and look at who the participatory decision makers funded, and I see a different version of the future myself, like it's professional development for me, and it's always really uncomfortable. And I say that because it's like, the principle here is that different people will make different decisions and actually unleash, and I know that sounds dumb because it's like, of course, they're going to make different decisions. But when they actually do go make different decisions, and like you are in the position of letting go of the power for those decisions to be made, it's really uncomfortable. And I was grappling myself with like, oh my goodness, relationship to power is different than I thought it was. It was like, Ghislaine, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, said in the chat something about unlearning. And it's been this deep process of unlearning. And that is just one story I will uplift for you of so many moments like that for myself and my team over the last 2 years of like deep unlearning of things that we thought we knew about youth adult partnership, about like working with broad-based constituencies over communities across the country, about just all kinds of things. So discomfort is like, expect it and expect your own relationship to power to be challenged by these different shifts in a way that even if you expect it, it's unexpected. With that, I'll pass it to Greg.
Right on to that. It's it's definitely happens. So the so I'll use this to touch a little bit on being an endowed foundation. Being an endowed foundation, one of the things that sort of changes the dynamic for us is that nobody on our board sort of made the money. Nobody on our board, it's not their money, right? So you don't have like an individual founder or set of founders or even a family and some of the dynamics that happen there. So you have, a group of people with relatively equal, voices and power, at that level involved in it. So that gives you freedom from certain dynamics, but it means you're subject to other dynamics as well, right? And then on the actual, thinking about the money, one of the freedoms about an endowed foundation is that we don't have to raise our annual giving budget every year, right? It's so to that extent, we're not subject to sort of the whims of the field, or we're not subject to what's fashionable that year. If there's something that we want to stay the course with, we can do so. But having a finite set of money where the only money that's coming in is coming from investment returns and we're not raising any money, that ends up, that can engender in some people a certain kind of scarcity mindset of its own, which is interesting to see. So when you talk about these debates that organizations have about, are we going to go above the 4.5%, annual giving standard? We've deviated from that a number of years recently, but still don't have a systematic way of doing so. And it's still a significant debate every time we do. So it's so you have some freedoms, but you also just have some different dynamics in some ways. And particularly the stuff over the money and the longevity and how you think about opportunity cost of doing something versus not doing something. That's something that's real and something that we're actively grappling with. And we haven't found a lot of models out there to help us think about it more systematically.
Thanks.
Yeah, there's so, I feel like this conversation is starting to go in different directions in the chat board, so I'll try to keep it aligned. But I do think that some of that, I'll just second the point on some elements of discomfort. So, but it's all healthy because it's actually aligned with our aspirations. We talk about proximity, we talk about getting closer. These are things that we talk about and we integrate into our practices. And the more we do it, the more we're going to have to face those moments of the inner, the implicit biases that we're facing, the questions that we have. So with all of this talk in place, every time we have a new person at NewProfit who gets involved in our investment selection with our constituents at the table, I find that they are surprised by how thoughtful our constituents' questions are, how much having the constituent on phone calls with social entrepreneurs fundamentally changes the dynamic of the phone call. It goes from our normal kind of garden variety conversations that we have, which we think are awfully interesting, to conversations that are much more deep and much more real. Frankly, some of our social entrepreneurs, they say to us, many of them say to us, I get to understand NewProfit because you brought these folks onto the call. And this is not a standard philanthropic organization as a result. So it has, but it has that effect even on our internal staff. Like I said, every single time a new internal person comes on, joins a process with our constituents, if they've been doing it for years without constituents involved, they say the same things like, wow, I wasn't sure that the questions would be as strong as they were. I wasn't sure, we try to give our, for our larger grants, we actually have constituents run all of the conversations with the constituents of that organization. So a parent will run conversations with a parent, a student, and a teacher at, the education organization that works with the education organization that we're trying to invest in. And we're observers. We listen, largely so we take notes for them, so like that's part of the shifting of power dynamics. We're like, here's the notes sheet. We're the ones taking the notes. That's all we're doing on this call, just so we can get insights that you're gleaning from this. So I do think that that's been one of the unlearnings, and one of the, it's just forcing us to internalize what we believe, but it's welcome in that sense. The other thing I just wanted to name, and this is going to be a little bit of a tangent, but since you mentioned it, Savannah, the decision making, and it's come up in the chat too. So decision rights are not. We all know decision rights frameworks: rapid, racy. We can name half a dozen more. But decision rights aren't binary. You either have the decision or you don't have the decision, but there's different types of decision rights. And we have, the way that we've approached this, and it's partially because of the way that we work with organizations, was that we had some uncomfortable conversations initially internally, where there were some people who were saying we have to give the decide right to our constituents. And others who were saying, I just don't know if we can do that, because the reality is, once an organization's in our portfolio, we have a senior person at NewProfit who's working with them for, on average, half a day to a day a week for 4 years. It's a very intense engagement model. So there's some elements of what we need to see in an organization that our constituents are never going to be able to filter for. So we talked to our constituents about it, and we said, how do you feel about this? And basically they said, actually, we would prefer not having the final decision. We would prefer being peers with you on this decision making. So that effectively the decision right we've given them in the RAPID framework is an agree, where if there's any organization that they feel uncomfortable with us investing in, it behooves us to listen to that. So we won't invest in that organization. And we have a process for kind of working through that with our Parent Advisory Council members, as an example. So I just wanted to name that. In our case, I think it really depends on the organization and the approach that you're taking. In our case, our constituent groups are really happy to not have the final decision making, because they say, gosh, like whatever you do at NewProfit, it's a lot of stuff. And we can't judge for that. Like, we're never going to be able to judge for that. And frankly, we don't want them to. Like, we want people to leverage the expertise that they bring to bear and not make them fit into our box. Otherwise, we have a likelihood of losing the expertise that they bring to bear, because we're making them a NewProfit employee rather than allowing them to stay in their external role as a parent leader and education advocate. So, yeah, I will pass it on to Meredith.
I'd love to comment on a slightly different topic around discomfort, but still related to metrics, but different than grant making. So we know, based on what we've heard from from calls with potential donors and existing donors, that there is some level of discomfort around not having necessarily a common benchmark or a common standard or a common metric. However, when you dig a little bit deeper to try to better understand the source of that discomfort, what we've found is that the source of the discomfort is this assumption that the absence of a common metric or a common standard means that there's an absence of rigor or an absence of performance, right? And that essentially these learning environments are underperforming, or they must be low quality, or they must not be effective. And that's absolutely not the case at all. So in fact, what we're talking about, in the absence of a single common metric, we've got 1,300 grantees who are all considering and evaluating success in many different ways. And so we do ask them, and again, this is participatory, it's voluntary. We will ask them, how do you think about success for your organization and the work that you deliver? What does success mean for your students and your families? How do you define it? And then what are you seeing? And it's their option whether or not to report this information to us. What we see when they report the information is we see all the myriad ways that they're evaluating reach and impact and success for their students on an individual basis. And so I just want to name that, because it's not that kids are going into these environments where they're being underserved. It's actually that they're thriving and they're flourishing in these environments, but they're doing so in just a tremendously diverse set of ways. It's a lot of different ways of accomplishing that goal.
I just want to pull on a couple of threads that I heard over and over, and there's been some chat in the chat about, sometimes we think of things as either or. We can do that in terms of power. So if we do participatory grant making or we shift power, it means all deference goes to one group versus kind of sharing expertise and coming together, that you don't need any standardized data and you're going to throw everything out and have nothing, as opposed to Sarah Slaughter in the chat said, maybe standard metrics make sense for some things, but not for other things. And so how do you combine them? But there really are sort of these dominant cultural values that feel like they get us stuck a little bit, when actually everyone on this call is doing the shifting of power in different ways to different extents that make sense for your organizations and your teams. So I just want to pull on that a little bit. I'm curious about the work that you all have learned needs to be done to help those that you're sharing power with do it effectively, to feel confident in doing it. Like I've sometimes been in programs or processes that bring students in, for example, and all of a sudden adults defer entirely to students, right? As opposed to understanding that students have one level and kind of expertise that is incredibly important. Other people on the call have different kinds. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to what you've learned about how you have to set the table in a sense, or seed the ground in order to make these this kind of sharing of power effective.
So I'll kick us off. I mean, for us, it's all about relationship building and then the actual proving the possible, to steal Kip's former motto. So the relationship building piece is we have to develop relationships with the individuals. So we source constituents from existing groups. So, Goodwill Industries, DC Pave, Kids First Chicago, Rise Colorado. I can go on with different kinds of places that we source our constituents from. So we've already built a trusting relationship with the parent organization, no pun intended, but the larger organization through which we're sourcing constituents. We've built a trusting relationship with that group, and that trust and credibility is part of what they pass down to us through their constituents. So, DC Pave, Maya Martin is talking to parents saying, hey, these guys are the real deal. They want to do this in an authentic way. They'd love to engage you. This is a pilot year for the way that they're going to set this up, but I've worked with them to design the pilot. So we've gotten some credibility from that, but then we still do relationship building conversations with each individual separately, as well as with the full group, so that the group is building relationships with one another over time. I can tell you our Kids First and DC Pave, Kids First Chicago and DC Pave parents are dying to go to the other city to understand what those groups are doing in the other city now. So relationship building is key. And that relational, this is true of everything we do at NewProfit. Relationship building internally with our social entrepreneurs, with our constituent groups, with our constituents rather, and with our funders. Relationship building is at the core of this work. With that foundation, I think then we can ask and we can really look at these people as peers, and not as tokens, because I think that deference happens, it's coincident with tokenism. And because I do think it's like, oh, this nice shiny object that we've never seen before, as opposed to like, these people have a perspective that they bring, real strong expertise that they bring in one area. I have different expertise. It was complementary. And that's how we can look at it as peers. And then finally, it's just really walking the talk. So when we're talking about, giving people an agree right, or acting in that kind of way, that is just about how do we make sure that, like, if we don't follow through on it, they'll call us on it and we'll lose trust. So well, sorry for taking up so much time.
No, it's fine. This was a great answer. And I think it's just a good reason for folks to come back for the next sets of conversations that we're going to have. I know a couple of you have to jump at the top of the hour. So first, I want to say thank you all for what has been a really engaging conversation. We can see it on the Jamboard. We can see it in the chat. So thank you all for your time today. There are some links in the chat that we will try and scrape and send out. For those of you who may have joined late, please know this was the first in a kind of larger body of work that we're trying to do at Grantmakers for Education that's really digging into equity and grant making. So please keep on the lookout for the next set of programs that we have. And I just want to remind you that there are a couple of other programs coming up this week. We have a briefing with Governor Hutchinson on K-12 computer science education on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, it's the future of education, rebuilding the architecture of teaching and learning. Hope to see many of you there. Thanks so much.